Guilty on all three counts. It took but 10 hours for the jury to make Derek Chauvin the state of Minnesota's first ever white policeman convicted of murder. We'll ask if the outrage sparked by last May's killing of George Floyd marks a turning point for the United States and a criminal justice system that's often violent, harsh, and where many of the country's 18,000 law enforcement bodies wield outsized power. A turning point for police reform, a turning point for racial justice in a country where any routine encounter can go frighteningly wrong if you're black. At the heart of the issue is mutual fear, a fear fueled by the vicious circle of race-baiting politics and record gun sales. How to defuse a situation when everyone's potentially suspected of packing a peace. Today in the France 24 debate, we're wondering if it is a turning point for the United States. And joining us from Minneapolis, she was there to cover it for us, Elisa Caverly, our correspondent. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Journalist Nita Wiggins is with us as well, the author of Civil Rights Baby. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
He is with us as well, André Rakoto, defense analyst and academic, whose training as an officer took you to North Carolina and Kansas, you say?
I was ROTC cadet, yeah.
ROTC, okay, there you go. From Cortland, New York, in the Finger Lakes region, political scientist Robert Spitzer. He teaches at SUNY Cortland. You're the author of The Politics of Gun Control. Welcome to the show.
Yes, it's good to be with you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. That video of Derek Chauvin with his foot on George Floyd's neck spoke for itself, yet still, there was relief after the verdict.
I think I'm definitely still processing the emotions. I don't think it's hit me quite yet, but I'm overjoyed. I'm very happy because this morning I didn't have no hope that this man was even going to go to jail.
I feel like the fact that we were able to secure justice for George Floyd means that we can secure justice for every black person who was killed by police.
Overwhelmed, I'm grateful, I'm relieved. So I feel grounded. I can feel my feet on the concrete. I'm super grateful that this is the verdict.
Elisa Caverly, tell us a little bit that relief, even though it seemed like an open and shut case, yet there was suspense.
Oh, the relief when the verdict was announced and it was guilty on all three charges was palpable in the air. Yesterday, I was standing there among a couple hundred people who had gathered outside of the courthouse. Just for reference, we're now in front of the George Floyd Memorial, which a lot of people still gathering today. But yesterday, outside the courthouse, the tension in the air, you could feel it. Everybody had talked about how their stomachs had dropped the moment that they found out the verdict was in. As you had mentioned, 10 hours for the jury to deliberate. Everyone was trying to predict, what does that mean? What does 10 hours mean? Does that mean a guilty? Does that mean not guilty? So the tension was so high in the air, and the moment we heard the verdict come down, the amount of cheering, and you could just feel the pressure sort of drop in the environment, and people were just so happy. They were laughing, they were crying, they were yelling, justice for George Floyd, and it really was just quite a difference. We talked to a few people as well, and they mentioned the same thing that we heard in the package, that they were expecting it to go their way, but they weren't positive, and they hadn't seen any history of that happening, right? So it was very hard for them to get their hopes up that it would happen this time, despite a video that showed what many people said was definitive proof. So everybody was just so relieved that for once justice was served.
Yeah, and there's an unsung hero in all of this. On the night when it happened last May, the initial police blotter makes no mention of what the whole world saw, that video. There was instead a statement put out saying the suspect was ordered to step from his car. After he got out, he physically resisted officers. Officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs and noted he appeared to be suffering medical distress. officers called for an ambulance. He was transported to hospital by ambulance, where he died a short time later. The next sentence in that press release by the police insists on the fact that at no time were weapons of any type used by anyone involved in this incident, which is true. However, cue 17-year-old Darnella Frazier. She had taken her 8-year-old cousin to the store and had the presence of mind when she saw what was happening to take out her phone and film. She testified at the trial of Derek Chauvin and spoke of her own anxiety since the murder.
It's been nights. I stayed up apologizing and apologizing to George Floyd for not doing more and not physically interacting and not saving his life. But it's like, it's not what I should have done. It's what he should have done. He should have.
That's the answer. Thank you.
Certainly one of the more poignant moments of that trial. You don't see her face. That's on purpose. Right. She was 17 at the time of the facts. No video, no verdict like this, right?
I'm afraid so. And one thing that her video does and her testimony, she puts the voice out there for the rest of us who are victimized. Those of us who were not even in Minneapolis. There are victims beyond Mr. George Floyd and his family when the police do the things that they do, when the domination of somebody happens like that. It happens too often. The last time that I spoke with you, we talked about the 95 unarmed African Americans that Attorney Crump says were killed by police from the time of Mr. Floyd's murder in May to December 25th last year. And so there are victims on a daily basis. And even people who aren't physically victimized or manhandled by the police, we have the psychological bruises. And here in my Paris community, I was speaking with another American who said to me that people don't realize that those Americans in France or wherever we might be, we are bruised again, and even worse than bruising when we have these types of cases that occur. And so thank goodness that the teenager, Darnella Frazier, captured those images and that contributed to this decision, this verdict that we had to have this.
It was the early 90s when we saw things being captured on video for the first time, and we thought, oh, this is going to change things, but it didn't.
No. This is a step that we needed to take, but this is where we are as a country. And Reverend Dr. Bernice King was quoted a few years ago as we all commemorated the death of her father. And she said, "Daddy had to die," because the death of Dr. Martin Luther King advanced the work that needed to be done. And so now when I look at this incident, Gianna Floyd, the now 7-year-old daughter of George Floyd, she has become someone around whom the country is rallying. And again, she recognized that her daddy would change the world. His death would change the world. And I can just wait to see if that is really going to be the truth. But if this step didn't happen the way that it did in the last 24 hours, the United States would really be in a world of trouble beyond the trouble that we already have because of racial domination and white supremacist ideas and policies that keep people down, not just black people, but other people as well.
Robert Spitzer, do you get the sense that right now, today, this is, on the day after, a story about policing, a story about racial justice? What is the most important element in all of this?
Well, it is certainly both of those things. But one point I would make at the outset is that we know that there is institutional structural racism in policing in America. That doesn't mean every police officer is racist or every officer treats African Americans somehow necessarily differently. But we know that there are training issues, structural problems in the system at large, although there are variations across the country without question. But when you zero in on the Floyd case and look at the particular facts of that case, a number of things stand out. And that's partly why you see varying kinds of outcomes when there are other trials. So in this instance, we saw this death of George Floyd unfold across 9.5 minutes. It was not a split-second decision. And I certainly agree that the film footage, the video film that was taken by the young woman on the scene was critically important. But I think the outcome would have been basically the same even if that video had not existed, because of the length of time, because of the number of witnesses, because of the medical and forensic testimony and information that was available. And the fact that this unfolded in slow motion allowed, of course, us to see what was happening and to make abundantly clear that this was a case of excessive force. There were other officers already on the scene. And to me, as the trial unfolded, I thought it was a foregone conclusion. I actually said as much to my students on Monday when we were talking about this very case. And the outcome certainly was the correct outcome based on the facts. I'm not sure I would view this as a sea change moment, but it could be a change moment.
André Rakoto, you agree?
I believe so, and I would like to go in the direction that Anita pointed out. It's not just African Americans, it's all Americans, because I think that there is absolutely a need to reform the police in the United States, probably in terms of training and how to use their procedures. The video of the death of George Floyd is sickening. When the man is on his belly with handcuffs on, there's no way he's going to run away. And the whole thing was, I mean, from the moment you look at it, you know that something is wrong. And it's very weird to see that happening. And I would just like to remind you that in 2016, a man named Tony Timpa died in Dallas, Florida, Dallas, Texas. He was kept in the same position for 13 minutes. He died after 13 minutes. His death was taken on camera. The footage exists. No one saw it because he was white. So the police in the U.S. kills people from all communities. The figures are here. So there is a major issue with the police methods, definitely.
Yeah, let's talk about those police methods, if you will. Minutes after the verdict in Minneapolis, attention started to turn to Columbus, Ohio. Police were called to a dispute in a driveway. The police body cam quickly released by authorities. It shows a knife-wielding teenager lunge at another girl. An officer then shoots Makia Bryant 4 times.
We know based on this footage, the officer took action to protect another young girl in our community. But a family is grieving tonight. And this young 15-year-old girl will never be coming home.
So André Rakoto, there again, is it about training? Because, yeah, she obviously was dangerous if she was wielding a knife, but did they have to shoot her 4 times?
If it was to protect the life of the other person, from a French perspective, the use of weapons is limited by 3 angles. You need to have a response that is immediate, simultaneous with the situation, proportionate, and needed. And it may involve killing someone, shooting at someone who is threatening somebody else. So I am not familiar with the details of what happened, but we are very much restricted in France, for instance, with those measures. And I don't see much of that in the United States. Plus, the environment for the police is different in both countries in the sense that you have the police Bill of Rights in many states in the U.S. For instance, Maryland just revoked it a couple of days ago, but it gives a certain dimension in which the police officers can do things that in France, for instance, they would not be able to do, or at least they would be judged by other people than the chief of police of the local force if they did something like that. So there's the fact that when a policeman is fired, he can be reemployed by another police department. I think that last year, 3% of all Florida policemen were already fired from one department before they were rehired in another department. Then you have the strength of the police associations at the local level influencing politics, which is not very sane in the situation we're talking about.
Are we headed that way though in France? Because we have the police, the national police, we have the gendarmerie,
yes,
and now we have more and more municipal police that have weapons.
Well, as long as there is a real, the way it's handled is done with ethics, it's okay. It's all about this. It's all about procedures and ethics.
Robert Spitzer, are you envious of France, where we have a national police force?
Well, I would say I'm envious of France to the extent that very, very, very few French citizens, civilians, carry firearms with them or have a right to carry firearms. That, I think, is the fundamental difference. I mean, there are many, but that, I think, is a critical difference between the U.S. and France, because an officer who makes a routine traffic stop or is called to a home for a domestic disturbance doesn't know if when the door opens or the car door or window opens that the person therein has a gun. And there are cases, some of which have been captured on film, of officers being shot or returning fire, and that is a profound difference that complicates things. With respect to the Columbus, Ohio case, I watched that video earlier today, and to me there were two key facts about it. One is that it is a chaotic scene that is unfolding rapidly. But secondly is that the girl who wound up being shot did have a knife in her hands and was wielding it toward another person, I think a girl who was pressed up against a motor vehicle. And this is all happening in split second. So this is a more typical instance of chaos, split second timing. The officer, there will be a full investigation without question, but this is a different set of facts, and it's not clear at all that the police officer didn't do the right thing at that moment.
Nita Wiggins?
When I think back to Seattle, Washington in the mid-1990s, when I lived and worked there, I was a sports reporter, but I suggested to the news team, I said, there have been too many of these police shootings where a black suspect is shot dead, a white suspect is shot in the leg. And I urged the news team to do some reporting on that, because I hear, and I've heard since the mid-1990s, that there's chaos on the scene. I agree, of course. But why, and if we search the statistics, why would we see that in a chaotic scene that's not full of black people mixing it up, why the black people involved in the scene end up with a fatality, but the white people in chaotic scenes typically end up with injuries? I have noticed that since the mid-1990s, and so it's probably time that somebody in news reporting looks at that, because statistics would bear that.
And the New York Times has done statistics on that. We'll talk about it when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're asking if the conviction of white Minneapolis police officer, former police officer Derek Chauvin, for the murder of George Floyd last May is a turning point for the United States. We're talking about it with correspondent Elisa Caverly, who's covering it for us from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Also with us, Nita Wiggins, journalist, author of Civil Rights Baby, André Rakoto, who is a defense analyst and who advises on defense and policing issues. Political scientist Robert Spitzer is with us from the State University of New York at Cortland. You're the author of The Politics of Gun Control. Elisa, just before the break, we were talking about instances of gun violence involving police officers, how regular they are. The New York Times on Tuesday counted at least 64 people killed at the hands of law enforcement since the beginning of the Derek Chauvin trial. 1/3 of those of the people killed were not armed, and about half of them were minorities, according to those New York Times statistics. And of course, what we saw on Tuesday after the verdict was a lot of people talking about a case that happened just several miles from where the trial was taking place. Elisa Caverly, the case of Daunte Wright resonating with a lot of people.
Yes, that's right. So the funeral is tomorrow. As we're talking about accountability taken, a lot of people not wanting to say that this is justice because justice requires a lot more than just one convicted case. So the fact that Derek Chauvin was held accountable for his actions is one thing. But now we are already moving on, which is, and I don't mean moving on in a derogatory sense, but we have a funeral now to cover for Daunte Wright, another unarmed black man who was killed by police here in Minnesota. And Minnesota, interestingly enough, is not usually on the forefront of racial divide. It has been known as having a very high quality of life. Governor Walz actually came on yesterday and interviewed about the issues that Minnesota has that these cases are bringing up. The fact that in the past 5 or 6 years, 3 high-profile cases, Philando Castile, George Floyd, and Daunte Wright, those happening almost back-to-back as we're watching this case, and now going to the funeral of Daunte Wright on Thursday. So this is something that has become a very big issue in Minneapolis. The Department of Justice here in the United States under President Biden has opened an investigation into Minnesota policing practices. So we celebrate, we mourn George Floyd, we celebrate a victory in terms of civil rights and racial bias in this country. But now a lot of people saying yesterday it's time to go back to work. So we can celebrate for one day, but today we go back to work. And it looks like that's what a lot of the Department of Justice and others are doing today, that this is not over. This is just the beginning of positive change in this country.
Elisa, for our viewers watching around the world, they don't associate Minnesota with tense race relations. They think of other U.S. states.
That's right. Southern states in particular, Los Angeles. There are a lot of places in the U.S. that people think about tense racial relations. It is not Minnesota. And the fact that the governor came out yesterday in an interview and acknowledged that that Minnesota has a very high happiness on the happiness index. They have great schools. There's a lot of positive things. It's actually one of the top in the United States for quality of life. And he said these exact words, except if you are black. So the fact that they are acknowledging, and the highest governing body in this state is acknowledging the fact that there is some serious racial issues here in this state is a step. It's a good first step, and hopefully this conversation will continue. This will not stop with one conviction. It will continue to have a conversation about racial bias in the police force and other places here in the state of Minnesota.
The Justice Department, Nita Wiggins, opening that investigation into police practices in the state of Minnesota. Your reaction, because we saw there was a lot of feuding, right, between the mayor of Minneapolis and the police back last year.
Let me turn to something Alyssa just said about quality of life. So I've been to Minnesota 4 times over the last 20 years. And what people may not know about Minnesota, that of the large metropolitan cities in the United States, Minnesota has Minneapolis has the widest gap in home ownership between black families and white families. There is a 50% difference in home ownership in Minneapolis. So there are economic reasons for that. And that is not showing that Minnesota and Minneapolis are so advanced and so much better than states in the South, for example. And so I do want to get to the point that the infrastructure bill that President Biden has talked about is to address housing, and housing is how people build wealth. And if we look at who the victims are, typically, the cases that come to the public attention, those people are typically from the families that are not wealthy, that have not maybe bought homes and have not accrued wealth and don't have intergenerational wealth. And so let's make sure that we recognize Minneapolis is a difficult place to live if you are Black.
All right, so it's part of what you're saying is a holistic approach. Let's listen to the U.S. president. He spoke late Tuesday after the verdict.
Today's verdict is a step forward. Nothing can ever bring their brother, their father back. But this can be a giant step forward in the march toward justice in America.
Robert Spitzer, listening to Joe Biden and listening to what Nita just said about needing a holistic approach if you're going to try to end this vicious circle of fear, of violence, and of killing. Are we perhaps at a turning point?
Well, it could be, and for a couple of reasons. Not only the Floyd case from yesterday, but it coincides with the transition of presidential administrations. And President Biden has said very specifically that he not only wants to target gun-related issues, but one of the most important programs he's proposed to bring back, which has not received, I think, the attention it deserves, is funding anti-violence programs in localities around the country. These programs in the past have proven to be quite effective in reducing violence, and if you have less violence to begin with, less likely to have the necessity of or likelihood of a police response. And that process, these kinds of programs were short-circuited to a great degree because of the pandemic this past year. You didn't want people obviously going door to door or meeting in in-person groups, but this is starting to happen again, and Biden wants to provide significant funding for that in a bill that he's earnestly trying to get through Congress, and perhaps with bipartisan support, he hopes. And that, I think, would be a very important prong to get at some of the root social issues. But the bigger point is that there is no single all-encompassing answer. Institutional practices have to be changed. The militarization of the American police that began after 9/11, almost 20 years ago now, is another reason why we see police responding in a more militaristic fashion, often to local emergencies and law enforcement problems, anti-poverty programs, housing programs, and gun measures as well. So it's a multi-pronged attack. There's a lot to do, but reason for hope because it's being addressed from multiple angles, I would say.
Multiple angles, but of course, it's a battle that's only beginning. We're seeing there have been cuts in funding in a lot of big cities to police departments because they felt as though it was too much. One example, Austin, Texas. Last August, they decided to slash the police budget by 35%. Well, that was quickly answered by the unions. The Texas Municipal Police Association posting this giant billboard warning, Austin police defunded. Enter at your own risk. And we've seen it in places like New York City as well, André Rakoto. The police unions are very powerful.
No, and but the problem is in those areas, crime is not going down anyway. So cutting down the police funding is one thing, but how do you maintain policing at the same time? The truth is, there is a way to do things. Sometimes the police is called on some scenes where the police may not be the most appropriate tool to use, and some things may happen because of that. So probably those cities need to look again at where they use their police forces. But defunding the police without offering that alternative is probably not the answer either. Now we were talking.
What's happened on that score? Because I looked at the statistics, and budgets for police departments have remained steady in America, whereas the rest of municipal budgets have gone way down over the last decade or two. So why hasn't more of that money gone to training so that these police officers are better trained?
They buy bigger, much better, much more efficient equipment, but they don't really need, by the way. I think that many of the money, the training system, for one, is probably not adapted today to the situation in the United States. And for instance, we saw a lot of riots and civil unrest in the streets of the United States after George Floyd died. And for one, I don't see any specialized crowd control or riot control units in the U.S. police forces. This is a need because managing a crowd is a specialty. It's something that you need to train for all year long to be totally incapable of protecting your adversary from yourself and from himself. What I'm saying is, in France, we have crowd and riot control forces, gendarmerie mobile, and CRS forces for the national police, which are specialized on that particular duty. It costs money, it's expensive, but at least you save lives. During the Yellow Vests demonstrations in Paris, which were pretty rough at some time, no one died. No one died because we used specialized forces which train all year long for that particular type of action.
We've talked about Texas a few times, and I talked with a friend, a former colleague who has spent 35 years in law enforcement based in the Dallas area. And he says the words that police officers fear the most, the two words are community review. Because police feel they have it handled. They feel they are doing and performing the way that the system should work. And in the minds of some, yes, the policing does function the way some in the system want it to work. But what we need to look at is who gets targeted, who gets pulled over.
More civilian oversight.
More civilian oversight. I've been pulled over 5 times while driving in the United States and doing nothing. And every time that there is one of these cases, I reflect back to the unequal policing that I faced. And I can't imagine what it's like for people who on a daily basis must get in their cars and hope that they can get where they're going and make it back and participate in American life the way that they would like. And so the reform does need to come in. And I would think that an easy step is to establish penalties for officers who sign false documents, false statements.
Yeah, when I said that they need to reform the training and the procedures, for instance, the Bristow study from 1963, which says that 1/3 of crimes will occur during a traffic stop, is still weighing heavily on the police mentality. And these things need to be looked at again and changed. So this is really the truth. They need to go through that path. Now there's one angle.
And
also,
is the myth correct that a lot of these traffic stops are for so-called revenue enhancement? Because the cops have been told, or as we say in France here, you've got to augment the numbers. We need you to make so many citations and hand out so many fines.
Not really. But the problem with the Bistro study in the U.S. is that if you believe in it,
right,
then you make it happen.
Right.
There's a big problem.
So it's the perception.
Absolutely. And now there's another angle to that because also the police has changed in the last 40, 50 years. 62% of the police officers in Los Angeles are minorities. 52% in New York. So Freddie Gray in Baltimore, who died in the hands of the police, 6 officers were involved, 3 were black. So the situation is also more complex with that. You may want to think that, hey, you know what? If we have more African American officers in the policing the black communities, it'll be okay. Well, it is not, because studies tend to show that they can be as brutal as their white fellow officers. And some studies in the Washington Post, by the way, were saying that actually they were even more brutal with African Americans than white officers. So it's a very complex situation.
And that brings us back to Robert Spitzer's point that there is this climate of fear. If the police are being brutal, it's because they're afraid. And if they're afraid, it's because, well, you're saying because of guns. And now there are these so-called open carry laws. The state of Washington is trying to do away with them. But right now, as all this is happening, South Carolina is putting one in. Texas is going even further with a bill that would waive the need for a permit to pack a pistol. And just so viewers understand what open carry means, it means that in some U.S. states, citizens can legally walk into a convenience store or a supermarket wielding a semi-automatic rifle. When you're, Elisa Caverly, when you see somebody walk into a store carrying a semi-automatic rifle, it's bound to make you a little nervous, no?
Of course, yeah. That's one of the things that I think the Biden administration is attempting to change. But again, federal law and state laws are very different. So you talk about South Carolina and the fact that they are changing or doing something different with their laws. They can do that, and so California also has very lenient gun laws, which is where we are. But there are very different laws depending on the state. So it is very kind of nerve-wracking to see somebody carrying a gun into a store here in the U.S., but a lot of people feel like that is their right as an American.
Again, Robert Spitzer, I ask you, are we at a turning point?
Well, we might be, but let me get to this point of carrying weapons. There is open carry of firearms so that anybody can see that you're carrying a firearm in many states, but it doesn't happen very much for the obvious reason that anytime a person sees somebody else walking around with a gun and openly displayed, it's terrifying and they tend to call the police. Even an organization like the National Rifle Association does not like gun owners to carry around guns opening. But the other thing that's going on, which is I think much more significant, is the spread of, which you referenced a minute ago, of no licensed concealed carry. In the U.S., a civilian can get a license to carry a gun with a very high bar to pass, kind of a low bar to pass, or and in both of those instances, you can get a license from the state. In one case, it's pretty tough. For some states, it's easier to get. But now we're at a situation where more and more states have eliminated permitting entirely, meaning that if you can legally own a handgun, you don't have to get a permit from the state. 20 years ago, there was one state in America that had no permitting for civilians to carry concealed guns around. Today, there are either 19 or 20 states that have eliminated permitting. You mentioned South Carolina moving in that direction. Texas is moving in that direction right now,
and
too.
Are they moving, Robert, are they moving in that direction because they genuinely think there's a safety issue, or is it part of these culture wars that we're seeing and we saw during the campaign where there was Donald Trump against Joe Biden?
Well, the answer is the second. But the first that you gave, the safety issue, is the excuse. It's the justification. The argument is that people will be safer, civilians will be safer, and they will suppress crime if they have their own guns with them. But numerous studies have demonstrated that that is utterly false, that civilians with guns are more likely to cause harm than to stop harm. Yeah. But that's not the messaging of the gun rights groups, because they want to spread gun ownership to the extent that they can. And it is that phenomenon which ratchets up the insecurity of police officers on the job, because the likelihood that the car that they stop or the house they knock the door on may have guns inside them, and that somebody might decide that they are being threatened and deploy a gun, and now you have a gunfight between an officer and a civilian for whatever reason.
All right, take the guns away. That's how you break the cycle of fear.
Texas, my state, has had open carry in place. It's probably 5 years now. And it is frightening to be in a place and someone is there packing an automatic weapon. But that is the state of things in Texas, and it has been that way for years.
We shall revisit this conversation. I want to thank you so much, Nita Wiggins. I want to thank as well André Racoteau. I want to thank Robert Spitzer for being with us from Cortland, New York. Lisa Caverly reporting for France 24 from Minneapolis on the Derek Chauvin trial. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.